as you can imagine, that exercise, especially aerobic exercise, endurance exercise, can make significant changes in our body. So one of the significant changes that people who are um, doing a lot of aerobic exercise experience is their cells have increased ability to use fatty acids as a fuel and increased intracellular triacylglyceride storage. Um, I mentioned during the metabolism part of our class that lactic acid fermentation can be occurring to make ATP after oxygen levels are depleted during high levels of exercise. So, muscle cells that are adapted to aerobic exercise, they have a higher threshold for how much lactic acid they can tolerate. Um, these cells also have an increased number of mitochondria and increased myoglobin production. Myoglobin can actually hold oxygen in muscle cells. We'll come back to this topic when we talk about respiration later in the semester. I just want to mention that now because the muscle cells do have a greater capacity to store oxygen in their myoglobin. In red blood cells, hemoglobin carries the oxygen, and then myoglobin can pick up the oxygen from hemoglobin as the capillaries bring oxygen into the skeletal muscles. If we do strength training, like lifting weights, we have very different adaptations as compared to aerobic exercise. So if you are lifting weights, you'll see the following changes. So muscle fibers increase in size and become thicker. They have more actin and myosin. Each muscle will have more myofibrils and more sarcomeres. And that's why you can see when someone lifts weights, their muscles literally get bigger. I mean, if someone doesn't exercise, their arm can be small. However, someone who works out a lot will have a very large arm due to building muscle. So muscle fibers really increase in size and become thicker. We don't see this with aerobic exercise, notably, so it'd be good for you as you're studying and thinking about how do you compare and contrast adaptations to aerobic exercise versus strength exercise. And notably, one of the big changes is when someone's doing weights is there are no change in the number of mitochondria and there are no changes in the myoglobin levels. So let's say your muscle got damaged. Let's say I don't know, you went weightlifting and you lifted too much. So you can actually damage your cells and get an injury. So it turns out that skeletal muscles have stem cells called satellite cells, and what these can do is they can fuse to damaged muscle cells and repair them, or even fuse them to each other to form new muscle fibers. And one of the important hormones facilitating the repair of damaged muscle um, by the satellite cells is myostatin. So myostatin actually inhibits the satellite cell. So myostatin is not good for muscle repair. So if you need to repair your damaged muscle, you need low myostatin levels because the myostatin actually inhibits the satellite cells from doing their repair job. So I don't know if you've noticed, but if you look at senior citizens versus like a 20-year-old, there's a huge difference in muscle mass, right? So when someone's a senior citizen, they have a lot less muscle mass. And okay, senior citizens can do muscle training or strength training to help with that. But in general, there's a big difference between a 70-year-old and a 20-year-old. One of these big differences is a reduction in capillary blood supply. So for that, endurance training can help. So if you have someone who's a senior citizen, they do a lot of aerobic and strength training, they'll be better off than someone who doesn't. And notably for the elderly, they have increased levels of myostatin production. That means when they have an injury, it's going to take longer to heal because they have fewer satellite heals that do that critical healing of the injured muscles. So that wraps up our introduction to skeletal muscle. Now I'd like to dive into cardiac muscle. So in contrast to skeletal muscles that are controlled by conscious ability decision to move, the cardiac muscles are regulated by the autonomic nervous system, meaning the heart beating is involuntary, right? It's just going to be happening from the central nervous system, and a pacemaker that we have in the heart stimulating contraction, because the heart cannot stop beating or will die. So it turns out the heart muscles have tons of mitochondria, and in fact, because your heart needs to beat continually, it's never going to get tired of beating, right? As long as you're alive, your heart is going to beat from the time you are a fetus to the time you are an adult. And if the heart stops, you will die. So, like skeletal muscle, the cardiac muscles have thin and thick filaments with sarcomeres. And yes, the filaments can slide with the power stroke. And this power stroke is dependent on the presence of calcium, and that is like skeletal muscle. However, unlike skeletal muscle, the cardiac muscles are connected by gap junctions, and basically these allow for the electrical synapses to pass from cell to cell. This is critical in the heart because we need the atrium and ventricle to be contracting as one. All the cells in the atrium and all the cells in the ventricle lining that need to contract in one contraction. And the gap junctions allow for all the cells making up the surrounding the atria and all the cells surrounding the atria to basically pump at the same time. Okay, and that's really critical. And the same thing for the ventricles pumping. So the gap junctions allow them to, even though they're individual cells, to function like one cell. They function as a unit, all these individual cells. So here's a picture of some cardiac muscle. They are, pretty linear, and they have branches, and they have these gap junctions that allow for electrical impulses to be shared between cells, and that plays a really important role in the contraction of the heart. And here's just an electron, a microscope picture showing the basically what the cells actually look like. That's depicted in this cartoon. So calcium channels are really important in cardiac muscle, just like there are in skeletal muscle. And there's some changes though. So one of the differences is that the voltage-gated calcium channels are not directly connected to the calcium channels in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Instead, what happens is that calcium will enter and then acts as a secondary messenger to open the calcium channels in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And then you still have, so we call this calcium-induced calcium release. And because there's a secondary messenger from the voltage-gated calcium channels triggering the opening of the sarcoplasmic reticulum calcium channels, the excitation-contraction coupling is slower. So from the time you get the depolarization to the time you get contraction in the heart, it's a slower process. Whereas in skeletal muscle, it's a very rapid process because in skeletal muscle, the two calcium channels are physically connected, and when one opens, the other one opens. In the heart, we have a little delay because the secondary messenger needs some time to be triggering its response. So let's take a look in the cardiac muscle. So the pacemaker of the heart, which we'll talk way more about in a couple of weeks, is going to trigger a depolarization event through action potential. This is going to lead to the opening of the voltage-gated sodium channels. Okay? As the voltage-gated sodium channels are going to depolarize the sarcoplasma, we're going to see then the voltage-gated calcium channels will open as the membrane potential increases. Then this is going to trigger, via this secondary messenger role of calcium, the opening of these calcium channels. This is a calcium-induced opening of the calcium channels in the sarcoplasmic reticulum membrane. Calcium will be released, okay? Calcium is going to bind troponin. It's going to lead to the movement of tropomyosin, and then therefore the myosin heads can grab onto actin and trigger the power stroke and contraction in an ATP hydrolysis-dependent mechanism. After that has happened, the calcium will dissociate from troponin, and then using an active transport mechanism requiring ATP, again, just like it does in the skeletal muscle, ATP is needed to bring calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And always in both of these cases, the sarcoplasmic reticulum has more calcium in it than does the extracellular fluid and the transverse tubule. Okay, there's more inside the sarcoplasmic reticulum. That's the bigger source of calcium. Yes, there is an important levels of calcium in the extracellular fluid and transverse tubule. However, that is not as significant as the levels of calcium coming out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum to be basically saturating troponin in the sarcoplasma.